forms of media that access the public has to reveal themselves, and so that indicates a greater aliveness to the media, and so you could argue that it's a continuation of the trend or this vision of going from one media to another, increasing liveness.
Yeah, that's really helpful. First, on the question of what exactly do I really mean by digital media, and the answer is that I haven't really kind of picked a place to stop. I was talking mostly about the internet to some extent, but then the internet, as you suggest, incorporates all kinds of other media and sort of so right, YouTube obviously has like self-generated video, so there's kind of film and other video media kind of embedded within the internet, all the frames, and this is part of what Kristin Bolter's book is about, is the way that the internet itself incorporates, most pre-existing media. Photography obviously is very important as is text on the internet. We often forget that it's like a medium that really does require literacy in a way that it's often talked about eroding literacy, when in fact all I do is read all day long on screen, right? So I think that's an important thing as to which digital media I particularly want to talk about. One could talk about digital and cable television, right? Because that's the fragmenting of kind of television from broadcast to digital, and therefore not time-specific television. That's, first of all, the proliferation of channels, and second of all, the fact that it's, with digital television recorders, it doesn't matter what time you watch it and all of that. But that's, again, as you suggest, don't see exactly how that would connect to the story easily.
Well,
but the YouTube, it does, for sure.
It would connect to the extent there's a proliferation of channels possible given the digital media, and with that proliferation you have a certain change in content. It may be that the content that requires is of a certain nature, perhaps more live. That would be an interesting thesis if it were so. At one point you did see a lot of cable television taken up by, they just needed to fill air, so they'd have, live people conversing or other sort of things.
Yeah, and the dilemma of multi-channel broadcasting was something that was immediately a problem in the Soviet Union because of the sort of desire to coordinate viewing and make sure that there was not excessive viewing of entertainment, or that a really entertaining humor show was juxtaposed with a party speech, and that would draw audiences away. So the dilemma of kind of multi-channel broadcasting is one problem that was kind of anticipated by all of this, and the ways that we are concerned about how this fragments audiences or whatever in some ways have things in common with that. But
I'm interested in source issues that you might have had in working in the early period, because certainly in the American case, there's a very difficult time trying to study live television, as so little survives, and kinescopes and even early video. So much of it was taped over and over. So how did you approach those kinds of issues?
Yeah, there's a reason this chapter is kind of a intellectual history of television rather than a history of the shows, which my later chapters really cover the shows because I can view them. No, you're right. There's very little that was saved. It's a problem as it is everywhere for live. There is some photography of sets, that's about it, and there's a great deal of verbal description of it, sort of like that tradition of verbally describing a work of visual art, but nonetheless there's a great deal of writing about it in the media and in kind of memoirs is an important thing, and that too, of course, is compromised in various ways. This is also the Soviet television golden age, and it's remembered in much the same way. All the animals in the studio and like zany adventures before anything was serious. It has the same kind of tropes that the U.S. memoirs from that period have. So the first problem is I didn't view most of the shows because you can't view them. So it is based on contemporary archival stuff. So there are discussions of how the shows went and meetings about them, what they talked about right after they made them or before, what they were planning, how they prepared for them, that kind of thing. But the accounts of what was actually visible is, as you say, very limited. It's memoiristic, and the memoirs started to be produced very quickly because this period began to feel like a golden age very quickly by like a decade later. So some of the memoirs aren't so remote, but nonetheless, it is definitely a problem. And it's worse in the Soviet Union even in later periods because they had shortages of all the film, and they didn't use video for the most part. They were using film until very late. And they reused it because there was such a shortage of high-quality film, so they would record over things. So a lot of stuff has been lost just because of that. But then again, they kept it all in a centralized archive, whereas we did not until very recently. So actually, in some ways, it's easier to do the research. Jonathan.
I'm just totally fascinating, all this stuff. I mean, the thing that's most interesting to me about this period of Soviet television and Soviet television more generally is like what is possible when it's not capitalist. And you touched upon that a little bit, but I feel like that's, and especially now, as like non-capitalist spaces are vanishing, it's interesting to think, but also as people are like imagining like what the future of the internet will be and stuff, or you know, how to struggle over that future. Like, what are the kind of weird forms and modes of thinking about a medium that are only possible in this context where, well, one, where you don't have to, the financial transaction is not one where you're selling an audience to advertisers, right, which very quickly in American TV just totally dominates the entire discussion about what you're actually putting on TV, right? It's all, I mean, and that sort of mass cultural machine had already been perfected in relation to magazines and radio, and then so it just sort of transfers on to TV, and so there's a very brief period where there's like, where people are thinking other things about TV that sort of quickly vanished as advertisers sort of came to dominate and like Nielsen ratings and who's, you know, and so it's all about like capturing the right kind of audience. Anyway, I mean, and you sort of touched, but I maybe idiosyncratic in this, but that's sort of what I would be really interested to hear about is sort of, and it might sort of whatever, be a selling point for the project as a whole as well, to sort of say, okay, look, here are these things that are, it's this sort of forgotten future, this or you know, this sort of moment of, and it's easy to, I mean, and we're all sort of like, okay, it didn't, obviously the Soviet Union had all these problems and so on and so forth, but still there are these sort of forms of imagining the media and actually concrete practices that then emerge that now, I mean, this is true from my interest in Soviet culture more generally. You look back, I mean, whatever, Soviet books from the 40s, I mean, all these, you know, all different kinds of Soviet media. You look back and it's just like, it's as if it came from another, like, universe or something, right? that really has a power to disorient and sort of defamiliarize the present. So anyway, so all the moments in your talk where you were sort of picking up on those kinds of things, I thought were really interesting.
Yeah, that's a good corrective, because in some ways, you know, everywhere I look, I find similarities. In part because there are so many limits to really calling it, it's not capitalist, but at the same time, because less, more so than pre-war media, because it's happening during the Cold War, it was shaped by, for example, teaching consumerism of various kinds. So there are a couple of ways to respond to that. So I think one answer is that it was not capitalist, but the dilemmas of like a state-controlled medium during the Cold War, when they're very much engaged. Television is a central medium for responding to the fact that Soviet borders are being penetrated by foreign radio broadcasting. So television is the alternative, the visually compelling medium that you can watch instead of listening to the foreign radio news. So they're very concerned with actually attracting audiences. So audience research and kind of tailoring it to audience schedules does happen. So they don't, and some of this is just the desire of any media producer to reach their audience, right? There's kind of no point in doing it if you don't want to reach people. But for example, they also developed to some extent a kind of day based on the viewer's workday. They don't have what we had, which is daytime television for women, because kind of women in the home was not a category that was to be either acknowledged or encouraged. So what they had instead during the day was kind of a repeat of the evening broadcast for all the students and workers who were on the second shift. So people who were home in the morning and then went to school or work after was a more kind of widespread organization of labor there. So they don't have, I mean, there's certain things, right? They don't really, I find it very interesting too, they don't have soap opera because they're uncomfortable with, they kind of want it because it's obviously a kind of used everywhere as a politically engaged, very compelling medium, right? It's, especially in Latin America, right? They have a lot of political, public health type messages in there. And they saw the power of this at the time, but kind of couldn't do it. There was something about that time structure that's sort of too engaging or addictive that they felt uncomfortable with. Also, the setting in the home was always a problem.